I'm going to kick us off. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Annie Helian, and I'm an advocacy officer with the International Rescue Committee, and I'm also the Utah and Nevada lab lead with the Refugee Advocacy Lab. So the Refugee Advocacy Lab is an initiative co-led by Refugees International, the International Rescue Committee, Refugee Congress, and the International Refugee Assistance Project. The lab works to advance US leadership on refugee protection and inclusion, and it does so by developing strategic communication resources, championing inclusive state policies, and building the field through new partnerships and refugee leadership development. And I have the pleasure and privilege of being your host and moderator for our training today. We're really thrilled and excited to center our webinar today on language access. Language access is really core to our work. Language access policies and programs help ensure the inclusion, success, and safety of newcomer and multilingual communities. So our conversation today will begin with a presentation from Michael Muley from the Department of Justice. A language access expert, Michael will share resources and other content that can help states think through their language access commitments and goals. We'll then hear from Laura Gonzalez-Murphy, the Director of New York's Office of New Americans, Margarita Larios, the Executive Director of New York's Office for Language Access, and Akram Rangren, the Executive Director of Hawaii's Office for Language Access, in a guided conversation. Though I know too many of us are very familiar with Zoom by this point, just want to note that today's setup is a webinar format, which means that we'll be recording for folks who aren't on the line. If you would like to ask a question of our presenters, please submit it through the questions box at the bottom of the screen. It's the little question mark. We'll address questions after the presenters have finished and the recording of the presentation has ended. And if you can't stay on the line for the full presentation or you'd like to review the information afterwards, we'll share a link for the recording after, and it'll be posted to the lab website. And with that, I will turn things over to Michael Muley.
Thank you, Annie. Let me just get my screen shared here and we will get going. Thanks for the opportunity. I really do appreciate it. And looking forward to hearing from Margarita, Laura, and also from our other colleagues today. 1 second. Let me just get it started. Okay. 1 second, sorry about that. Okay. So, language access. Wanted to give you an overview of my contact information here if people have questions. But today, I'm going to be talking about 3 topics. First, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as it relates to national origin discrimination against persons who are limited English proficient, or LEP. Second, Title VI LEP guidance that has been issued by federal agencies. And lastly, language access planning and assessment tools and related resources. So those are the 3 topics. There's a lot more in this topic. There are a lot more things to discuss in language access, but these are the introductory topics, and happy to do follow-up and answer any deeper questions in the Q&A session. So let's start with the first one. First, let's read the law that these language access protections are based on, which is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and how it applies to persons with LEP. So here's the statutory text. And what it says is that an entity that receives any type of federal financial assistance can violate Title VI if a person is subject to discrimination on the basis of race, color, or national origin. So Title VI protects each person from discrimination in any program or activity that receives federal financial assistance. Title VI protections are not conditioned on the number of individuals in the protected group who speak a particular non-English language, or things like the immigration status or income of an individual. The statute says no person. Title VI applies to each entity that receives federal financial assistance, whether that's directly or indirectly. And so it includes state and local agencies and departments, and also nonprofit organizations. All of the operations of these entities that receive federal financial assistance must comply with the non-discrimination requirements of Title VI. Just a note here, Title VI does not prohibit discrimination against a person based on their disability or a person with a disability. Other laws do that, like Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act, and other federal laws. Those laws address discrimination against a person with disability, which is defined to include a person who is deaf or hard of hearing. Just want to make that clarification and distinction between Title VI and other federal civil rights statutes. Next, and related to the first topic, let's talk about the connection between Title VI and language access protections. Title VI is the basis for language access protections for a person with LEP. In 1974, the United States Supreme Court, in a case called Lau v. Nichols, described how a school district was required to take reasonable steps to provide LEP students a meaningful opportunity to participate in federally funded education programs. In a unanimous decision, that court held that language-based discrimination constitutes a form of national origin discrimination prohibited by Title VI. As a result, Title VI and its regulations require each recipient of federal financial assistance to ensure that each LEP person has meaningful access to the information and services they provide. So Title VI requires each entity that receives federal financial assistance to take reasonable steps to provide meaningful access to each LEP individual, whether that individual communicates in a less frequently encountered language or a language that is more commonly encountered or has a more significant population. While the steps a recipient might take to address the needs of an LEP individual may be different, each recipient must ensure they're providing meaningful access to each LEP person in their service area. Another note here, because this question does come up, so let me address it. Some entities are in a jurisdiction in which English has been declared the official language under either state or local law. These entities continue to be subject to federal civil rights requirements. Federal laws can displace or preempt provisions of state or local law. For that reason, official English laws or the equivalent do not shield an entity that receives federal funds from its responsibilities under federal non-discrimination laws like Title VI. So let me go to the next section, which is the agency LEP guidance. Executive Order 13166 was issued in August 2000, and it required every agency that provides federal financial assistance to issue Title VI guidance to those recipients based on Title VI and its regulations. All Title VI LEP guidance documents issued by federal agencies in response to Executive Order 13166 were modeled on the DOJ Title VI LEP guidance, which was issued the same day as the executive order. And in that guidance, DOJ explained, this is the one quote I'm going to do, just let me do this one quote. They explain, quote, "This policy guidance does not create new obligation, but rather clarifies existing Title VI responsibilities." Like I said before, the obligation by a recipient of federal financial assistance to provide meaningful access arose long before the executive order in 2000 and originates with the text of Title VI in the statute and its regulations. So in general, though, the DOJ guidance and the LEP guidance of other agencies describes the types of language assistance services, when recipients should provide those services to ensure meaningful access, the importance of having a written language access program, the importance of periodically reviewing and updating this program, and the need for staff training on language access policies and procedures. The executive order also required agencies to take reasonable steps to provide LEP individuals meaningful access to the agency's own federally conducted programs or activities based on the DOJ LEP guidance. So these LEP guidance documents, just to clarify, are not enforceable. What is enforceable and what are the obligations are Title VI and its regulations. So let's get to planning, which is the last topic, and some resources. The language access planning page on the website www.lep.gov includes many resources to help you assess your current language access program, the needs of your language communities, and how you address those needs. So there's two related resources on that page. The first one here, which is in the first bullet, is the Language Access Assessment and Planning Tool for federally conducted and federally assisted programs, which you can use to assess your current language access plan, policies, and procedures. And related, which is in the parentheses here, the commonly asked questions document that addresses some additional questions that you might have about the self-assessment tool. A self-assessment can help you determine if you're communicating effectively with LEP individuals and can inform the language access program planning process. And in the tool that's linked here, there are 6 key elements. First, understanding how LEP individuals interact with you. Do they call? Do they come in person? Do they come to public meetings? Do you ask them to send in applications? Are they accessing a website or electronic communication? The second one, identifying and assessing your LEP communities. This is the number or proportion of LEP persons from each language group in your service area, those who are eligible for your programs, and the systems you have in place to track their primary language information, meaning their preferred written and spoken communication. Third, providing language assistance services. To provide meaningful access with LEP individuals requires providing appropriate language assistance services, which are often either interpretation or translation services. But they need to be in place so staff can provide those services. So assessing how you provide language services. The fourth item in the tool addresses training staff on policies and procedures. Staff who interact with the public should be trained on your language access policies and procedures, how you identify language, how you access and provide the necessary language assistance services, how to work with an interpreter, how do you request a document for translation, and how do they track the use or need of language assistance services for that person and when they come back so that you have that information recorded. The fifth item addresses providing notice of language assistance services. You need to inform the LEP communities that you have about the availability of not just your programs, but the availability of language assistance services themselves in a language they understand. Having the notice in English is of no value. It needs to be translated in a conspicuous notice in a conspicuous location in their language that explains, these are the services we provide. This is how you can request those services. And that type of notice should be included in any kind of general public communication that you put out, whether it's your website or whether it's a brochure. The last piece, the sixth piece, is monitoring, evaluating, and updating your language access policy, directives, plans, and procedures. This requires you to assess how you are providing services, whether these services are effective. Are staff trained? Do they know how and when to provide services? And are improvements necessary? Are these things that you put in place actually effective? Each of these elements, and this is just a summary, there's more detail in the document, but each of these elements help you identify the items that need to be addressed by your language access program, the items that you've already addressed successfully, and which types of procedures or policies need to be addressed, need to be updated. I mean. The second bullet, another item on that page, another resource on that page, is the Translation and Interpretation Procurement Series. Those are a series of 5 documents that explain things like how to hire and work with interpreters and translators, and how to build effective language access programs. So those are the 3 things for today. The requirements in Title VI, the agency guidance documents, and then the resources related to planning. This last slide here are some select resources related to this presentation. Like I said before, lep.gov is the website of the Federal Interagency Working Group on LEP and has pages about language access planning, but it also has pages on topics including resources for state and local governments, specific page for law enforcement, a specific page for courts. There's also the Title VI legal manual that has a more detailed explanation of the Title VI concepts and the requirements of the statute I briefly discussed today. There are also letters of finding. Department of Justice has issued a couple Title VI letters of finding related to language access, and they're linked here. We've also, in federal cases, we've also filed statements of interest in these 4 cases listed here in matters in private lawsuits in federal court related to language access services or compliance with Title VI. And linked there is the tool that I mentioned before, and also linked there is the tips series that you can use. But that's all I have. Thank you for your time. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to learn from you. I think, everybody on the line has learned so much and is able to take all of those findings forward with all of the resources you shared. I'll now direct us to our guided conversation to learn a little bit more about how 2 states, New York and Hawaii, are making language access a reality in their communities. I think we're just waiting for tech stuff. Okay, there we go. Cool. If we can just start with a round of introductions, I think everyone on the line would love to get to know you.
Yeah, I'll start then. Okay, aloha everyone. My name is Afirak Bamrungrian, or people in Hawaii call me AP for short. So I'm the Executive Director for the state of Hawaii. And thanks for allowing me to join your panel today. It was my honor to be here. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Margarita Larios. I use pronouns she, her, and ella. I'm the Executive Director of the Office of Language Access for New York State. Delighted to be here with my colleagues. It's always so refreshing to be in a room full of folks who are so experienced and passionate about language access. That presentation from Mike was just so wonderful. And I'll hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Gonzalez-Murphy.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. As Margarita said, it's a pleasure to be here with everybody and with passionate people about the topic of language access. I appreciate the invitation to being able to share the example of my agency. I'm Laura Gonzalez-Murphy. I'm the director of the Office for New Americans in New York State, but also carry for the Department of State the important title of the Language Access Coordinator. So thank you again, and eager to converse with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being here. I think, one of the most special things about this conversation is we have a great example of the US's oldest Office of Language Access with Hawaii, and then our newest with New York. And of course, you have very different vantage points as the first and newest offices of language access. Can you give a little bit of insight on what prompted the establishment of your office?
Okay, I will start in as the oldest office. Okay, for the state of Hawaii, I think in 2006, the prompt that make us to create the Office of Language Access, because there are some consistency in the agency that provide language services to the LEP individual. Because that we have heard from Michael that the Title VI only apply to the program that receive federal funding. But we recognize that there are a lot of program and activities that do not receive federal fund. So they have some gap, they have some, in Hawaii, it's called some puka, because it creates some confusion whether or not our program, what type of funding we receive, or how the agency provides services, as well as the LEP, which program that they can request for the services. So we recognize that, and we, by the work of our advocacy and the people who work from the community, they create the bill, they introduce the bill, create the Office of Language Access, which is now it mandate that all the agency that receive state fund have the same obligation to provide language services assistance to LEP individual. Basically, they affirmatively address the need of the Title VI, as well as incorporate the EO 13166 into our local state statute. So now, because of that result, now all the agencies in state of Hawaii who receive public funding, whether or not federal or state funding, are obligating to provide language services to the LEP individual. So I think that kind of filling in the gap, so create eliminate confusion, as well as to ensure all the people who access government program have access to the services. And by creating our office, it also helping state agency in implementing the language access obligation. So basically just helping us coordinating resource and effort to help eliminating some issue that the agency have to facing during that time. Thank you. I'll keep it over to Margarita. Thank you.
Definitely. And thank you for sharing that, AP. And I would say that, you know, our story is very similar in the sense that, you know, of course, knowing that 30% of New Yorkers speak a language other than English, and that 2.5 million New Yorkers don't speak English very well, the need was clearly there. There had been an executive order from 2011 that, you know, was the beginning of the legal framework from a state perspective to provide language services. But as AP described, you know, there are ad hoc necessities for different agencies and different even linguistic populations, different areas of the state that, you know, had become very apparent through not only community feedback, but also the groups that represent these communities. So last year, Governor Hochul enacted into law our language access policy for the state. And now we have section 202-A, which also was how she established the Office of Language Access to be the organism like the Office of Language Access at Hawaii that, you know, really supports the agencies that provide the services directly to the public. And there are different, I would say, areas there of the work that we do for sure. There's, you know, centralized coordination as part of our work, but there's also a lot of opportunity, you know, for centralization, optimization, and really learning from the agencies that are doing terrific work, just like the Department of State, whose language access coordinator joins us today, and, you know, helping build that model up is part of what our mandate is here, you know.
Yeah, certainly. I don't know, Laura, would you like to add to that at all?
Only that, you know, while the direction that we've had in New York State, I very much agree with Margarita with her emphasis about how we saw, because every agency is different, and because in New York State we have such a diverse community, how we saw the need for a coordination to be able to provide, you know, that it isn't easy to provide language access. So in order to be able to provide it in the best possible way to the community, to the individual themselves, through state agencies, for our case, that coordination was really something very important that we saw. I was here at the state before the office as part of those executive orders that Margarita made reference, and in conversations with even then a centralized leadership trying to decide how to create this, the idea was, you know, that coordination office is necessary. So we were very excited to hear when Governor Hochul directed the creation of the office.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you kind of spoke a little bit to this, but you both represent incredibly, well, you all represent incredibly diverse states with huge language diversity. I was wondering, what do you think the role is of language access in ensuring that all individuals feel represented and represent themselves in our communities? And with that, how is language access able to ensure the success of new Americans?
Okay, I will take the first dip on that. Okay, I think one unique aspect of our language access law, we build in what they call language access advisory council in our statute, which is allow 17 members from the communities that representing people, including the LEP population. We also including the agency that provides services to immigrants. We also have, because Hawaii, our geographic area is from different islands, so we also including representative from different islands, because small island might have different need, different challenge that might not what they call Oahu centric like me. So including representative from people from various organizations, various demographic would allow us to hear, and would also would allow them to represent, have their voice in the process of improving language access. And all the 17 members is appointed by our governor and have to go to the confirmation hearing to the Senate, because we recognize their contribution and we value their contribution to our community and their service. So by doing that, it's part of recognizing and celebration, allow them to feel proud and bring in the knowledge as well as concern or comment to the group. So this is the way that we including people from the community and allow them to representing themselves, have their voice on the table, because that's their role. They are advising me as an executive director on how the way we improve the language access in the state of Hawaii. Another component for my office, we're not just serving the state agency. We also serving another two groups, which is including LEP community, as well as the service provider, which is the language interpreter and translator. So all of them have some voice. We have what they call ad hoc meeting. We have language access working group. So we allow participation, and we not just invite them to the table. We also looking to bring the table to their community. We go out there, listen to their voice, listen to their concern. And I would say one thing that Hawaii is really unique compared to New York, because we are a really small state. We have only 1.4 million population. It's just unable to compare with New York. So everyone know each other. That kind of make it easy for us to create connection among the community. I would say that is advantage of one thing that we have in state of Hawaii. That kind of a way how we including them in our community. And one thing that I would say unique about state, our law is that we allow our LEP individual to self-identify themselves as being LEP and inviting them to request the services. Because one unique thing that we might have heard that some agency might take the position that LEP have to affirmatively address to request the services. So, and if we're working with an immigrant like myself, the concept of language services is not existing in another country. So they might not aware of that they can request the language services. So we try to educating them and inviting them identify themselves that they are LEP and we need the services. So it's kind of helping both person as the LEP themselves as well as the state agency that they know that this person need the services. So that kind of the way to we empowering our LEP individual under our state law. Thank you, and over to Margarita Aurora. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll definitely chime in on that, and I'll say that definitely hearing from the community is such a huge part of it, right? I can say that from my personal perspective as a practitioner, it's really easy to get very much focused on what your work and not seeing it from different perspectives and seeing it with the lens of the different people involved in this work or who are receiving the services. So I really think that focus on hearing from the community what they need is a huge part of the work. The Office of Language Access, in our foundational phase, we were established in October. We're really undergoing all of our assessment activities to understand what are the things that we need to do, what are the resources that we need to create, the process, the tools to streamline the way that agencies are providing services so we can be there for them, right? How can we help them do what they're doing already even better in a way that is most meaningful to their own populations, whether it be from the perspective of the nature of the services they provide or from the linguistic perspective, right? Because as Laura mentioned earlier, we're so diverse, right? And oftentimes the focus could be the city, right? New York City, the most linguistically diverse city in the world. And yes, of course, there's huge need there. But on the other hand, especially when we're talking about refugees, newly arrived immigrants, we want to focus upstate, right? And we want to make sure that we're also focusing on the languages that we're seeing in that population. So I think it's all about thinking of meaningful access, and you can't get that without engaging, doing like grassroots outreach, talking to advocacy groups, which, we're doing, and like hoping to establish a good system so that we can continue to do that regularly and meaningfully, and just have that sort of localized approach in a way, which I think is a great segue into the work that the Department of State does. Laura, if you want to chime in about that.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Margarita. And to that very point about, being able to communicate with the local and being informed for the Department of State, I think even going back to your first question earlier, and in terms of what, with the diversity that we have, what's the role of the Office for Language Access in New York State, what it has done for us. So for our own services, to be able to address the diversity, using the office and the services that they're providing to us as that, kind of one arm of the many different agencies that exist, is the guidance. We rely on that guidance that that OLA, as we call it, is providing to us, even just from basic, well, it's not so basic, but it's having a centralized contract of all the providers. It takes away from each agency, from us, the onus of vetting them, of discussing the cost. So bringing your question to very nitty gritty, of the relationship and our need for that coordination and that example, that leadership that OLA provides to us, it allows then for my agency, my language access program, with our team, to be able to be in more direct contact to what the needs are for our services per the community that access them. Department of State is, it's comprised by many different divisions. So licensing, MMA, boxing, we regulate all of those, cemeteries, and then of course the Office for New Americans. So along with that, there's complexity as to what needs the community is going to have, what languages those services will address. So it really is about hearing what that individual needs of each of those services, how best to facilitate it. But like Margarita and AB mentioned, it's communication, hearing from them. But fortunately, we're able to provide that part with more fluidity for with our services, because we do have that guidance from OLA, that centralized help to take that onus away. I think you asked, how can language access ensure New American success? From our agency, I think we've seen that by really facilitating the ability of our New Americans to understand and enhance their knowledge of what they're entitled to in this country. I think AB mentioned, many of those home countries, they may not realize that they have that right, and that then language access is empowering them. This is the experience we've had at the Department of State, that empowers them to feel safe and to then be able to contribute to the development of their new home. So connecting those services, information. So, I could go on, but I think that's it.
No, I really appreciate that. I think that you all touched on a really important point that I always think of with language access, is this idea of empowering people, right? Empowering multilingual people, empowering New Americans, empowering our communities. And I was wondering if you could just touch on that a little bit more. What do you see as the role of language access in promoting language justice? And then, of course, with getting marginalized folks in connection with power and connection with their communities.
So let me start again. I'm sorry. So let's talk about, when we're talking about language access in the framework of the language access per se, we're just talking about basic two things, that we empower LEP, educating them about their right to get the language services from the agency. But at the same time, we also educating agency to provide and understand their obligation. And by doing that, so they have to looking for the tool, looking for information, or create infrastructure just to provide language services under language access framework. So that I see that is the foundation for all the society moving into the language justice. Because when we have the solid foundation, when the agency know the tool, when people know that they have the right to speak, not to be ashamed of, in their speak their own language, not feel discriminating because we speak the same language. It can lead to the world what they call the language justice, where everyone can feel free to express themselves in the language that they are comfortable, and create equity, and it create inclusion. That kind of, I can see the language assets as a foundation built up on towarding the language justice from that perspective. Give it to Margarita to add on that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's so hard to follow what you say, AP, because I wholeheartedly agree. But I will say that I do think that, we're fortunate in a way that we are in this point in time where clearly diversity, equity, and inclusion are at the center front. And really, language access is an anchor within diversity, equity, and inclusion work. It oftentimes doesn't get seen or perceived that way, but it really is, right? So to be able to meaningfully participate, or as Laura said it, build your new home or feel like you belong, you definitely need to be able to, to express yourself, to be proud of yourself, to celebrate yourself, right? And language is such a huge part of our identity and our culture. Like one doesn't exist without the other. So being able to not only give access to the services and benefits that you have a right to as someone who is, located in New York State. Beyond that, it's a change in culture, right? It's saying, not only can you come and ask for it in your language, we want you to. We celebrate the diversity that makes New York State in this case as diverse as it is. And we want to create that sense of belonging, and celebration of that diversity of cultures.
So I think that's pretty hard to follow too from maybe you, Margarita, but I'll bring it to the agency perspective. For example, from my agency, for the Department of State, to us, language justice, I think is linked to success. So for our agency to be able to empower those new Americans to not be afraid to ask questions of us, of what access, what license can they achieve? Can they not feel a fear to ask for an interpreter when they're coming to take a test, to learn, to understand that surrounding, even if it's, like Margarita mentioned, not a language of their country. So they're making this their home, and the success for DOS is that we're able to nurture a more just environment of communication between that, new American accessing a service that we provide. So in that justice for our team, I think would mean that they were able to get what they needed here at DOS.
Thank you so much for all of your answers. I can confidently say this has been the best part of my day. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I just really appreciate the way that you talk about language access and justice and inclusion. It's just really fantastic. I would like to talk to you about this forever, but unfortunately we're kind of running low on time, and I want to make sure that our community members can ask a few questions. I wanted to leave it at one last question for this guided conversation, just pulling it a little bit into practicality. We're all very jazzed about language access, but unfortunately getting agency buy-in is kind of difficult. I wanted to ask, is this a challenge that you've faced, and how have you been able to overcome that challenge? I think especially for the state agencies and the state governance that are on the line, it's really important to hear how to get other people involved and other people making this practical.
And I will start. I think the big challenge that to make the agency to see language access is the priority. Because many of them see language access as what they call unfunded mandate. I understand that a lot of agencies might have a lot of competing priority because based on the budget, based on the certain subject matter, or based on the need of the community. But language access is not the thing that the afterthought. The agency have to see that it's the forefront, it's at the front door for all individuals, because they what language they speak, to be able to access the services that they provide. So it's really important. I mean, that I have seen the challenge about setting them as making them see it as a priority. And also, another thing is that have a full-time dedicated language access coordinator, because being language access coordinator, as we've seen even in state of Hawaii, is an add-on function to another job that somebody already have it. So we appreciate that they're willing to step up to working on, but lacking the full-time dedicated language access coordinator can be a challenge in improving language services in each department. So this is the challenge that, at least from the way of my office seeing it, we're still working on it. We are not perfect as well. So we're trying to working toward the leaders, working to the agency to educate them about, okay, it's not an unfunded mandate. You, like say, you get funding from the federal. So that's why the Title VI follow you, language access law follow you, because you get money. So the funding is there. So just set the priority, not how to do that, and advocating them to have a full-time language access coordinator. Because like Laura and Margarita say, the difficult part about implementing language access is just about coordinating different pieces together, because we don't want everyone to go on silo and working on their own. By coordinating everything through just one centralized function, that would be help a lot. So I'll give it back to Laura or Margarita. Thank you so much.
I'll say that I really like thinking of the language access work in incremental steps, right? Because it can be really intimidating to just find yourself in the position where you're like, I have to start from scratch. What do I do? Well, clearly there's a wealth of resources like the ones that Mike shared with us earlier today, but it's also a matter of assessing, right? What is your need and what is the most meaningful way to respond to that need, even if it's in incremental steps. I think that's the number one thing too, not be intimidated and think that you need to have everything set up perfectly by tomorrow. Like AP said, we're all continuing to grow and continuing to improve in our approach and in what we're able to provide. And that's so much better than not doing it, right? Like we're here today talking about 2 offices of language access. So clearly that's the way to go, incremental steps. And I would say when it comes to getting buy-in, I think the social justice lens is really important, definitely getting folks who are passionate and involved in it. But at the end of the day, sometimes you will also need to have just your data, be able to make a business case about what is the need. Numbers sometimes tell such a great story, if you're able to see the patterns in them. I have to say my background is not in numbers, but I've learned to love data because it really shows, it can tell a story of who's out there and what do they need, So that's a great thing to be able to leverage data. And to mention things like what AP said, this is the need, and here are the resources because there is funding for it. And do not forget that we have great partners in advocates, community-based organizations. I know that AP's office definitely has a great relationship with the community as well, and that's not only the way that we learn what we need, but also they support us in ways that no one else can. They're uniquely positioned to say, this is necessary, we need to continue to support language access. And finally, I would say to identify champions in strategic positions, right, that are able to provide the leadership and to promote this work as one of their priorities, like AP said.
I'll go ahead and add a little bit to that. I think what you both said, I agree with, and especially in terms of the agency and the challenges. I agree with the need for, an individual that is fully focused on the issue. We are lucky at DOS, though, to have had the buy-in in our leadership that has allowed us to grow. I mean, I am the director of the Office for New Americans, work on coordination, but I have a team, a deputy, a language access coordinator, and a full-time staff for language access, because they realized how much we needed that support. So this being said, that buy-in that we had is why, by understanding what language access means. I think that was one of the barriers that we've slowly, the team has been chipping at, is really creating that awareness that addressing and providing language access is beneficial to the community, including citizens. Otherwise, not knowing why should I provide that? Why should we invest in it? It can be problematic. So the impact with examples, the data that Margarita mentioned significantly, the communication, the use is very big, but the examples of economic and social and cultural development and growth, I think have been for us, and it's easier because we have the Office for New Americans, so we have that relationship to identify them. But I'd like to share with you one eye-opener for me as we were building and growing our own little team here in DOS was when an individual, a US citizen, said that uses ASL as a first language, said, English is my second language. And then realizing, it's not about languages spoken outside of the US as well. It's ASL, sign language, a US citizen sharing to that. It was an eye-opener, and I think that's part of one of the barriers of understanding languages that benefit and that right.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate all of your insights. I'm going to pull it to our question and answer section.